Okay, that bumper video is supposed to be longer. Well, good morning, everybody. And so I have my football socks on. They're not as cool as Justin Figg's socks, as his are 49er socks. Mine are just football socks with X's and O's on them. And then I wore this shirt, which please don't mistake it that I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan. And that could be that could be an issue in our marriage, because my wife, she says she's a Chiefs fan because she was, raised in Kansas City. And I was born in Kansas City, but I was raised in the Bay Area, so I'm a 49ers fan. The reason it's not an issue in our marriage is because she doesn't care about football. So, anyway, she just likes to give me grief on that. She calls it idol worship, but we're going to have my goal for the Super Bowl party was just let's make it really not labor intensive, easy and fun, and so that's all. It's going to be informal, but I would just like a show of hands on, if you plan on coming today, would you just let us know so we know kind of how many people to set up for? Okay. It's going to be more fun than humans should be allowed, especially if the 49ers win. Actually, I think I'm a gracious loser, but I can be an obnoxious winner, so. And I want to there's a slide I want to start off with. This has nothing to do with Esther again, but it's a slide of Brock Purdy. It's the 49ers. There you go. And so this is Brock Purdy. 2 years ago, he was Mr. Irrelevant, the last person chosen in the NFL draft. And now, and this is what he said after the game 2 weeks ago when the 49ers came from like a historic deficit to win. He said, "I put my faith and trust in him, and he's gotten me where I'm at. So when I'm down 17 at the half, honestly, I'm just like thinking, all right, God, you've taken me here, and win or lose, I'm going to glorify you. That's my peace, that's the joy, that's the steadfast that I have where I get it from, and that's the honest truth." So I leaned into that, and sure enough, we were able to come back. And so it's just nice, it hasn't gone to his head. He's still humble, and he still gives God the glory. And so, I'm not saying that the 49ers are God's favorite team, but, you can draw your own conclusions. Pete Dexter was a famous columnist in Los Angeles for a number of years, and he told a story about some neighbors who agreed to watch their friend's house while they went away for a 3-day weekend. Their friends had a pool in the backyard, and so they went for a swim. And as they got ready to leave, their dog, whom they'd brought along, came from around the house with a dead rabbit in its mouth. And they remembered that their neighbors had a bunny, and now they realized that their dog had killed it. What to do? Well, they took the rabbit, and they washed the blood and the dirt away and blow-dried the fur and brushed it out to make the rabbit look as good as possible. And then they carefully put the rabbit back in its hutch, closed the door, hoping the neighbors would think the rabbit had died of natural causes. A couple days later, the neighbors returned home. They watched from their kitchen windows. They pulled into the driveway and walked in the house. And several minutes later, they got a frantic phone call. "There's a real sicko loose in our neighborhood. There's a pervert on the loose, I tell you." He said, "Well, why do you say that?" "Well, before we went out of town, our bunny died. And some sicko has dug him up and cleaned him up and put him back in his hutch. There's a real sicko running loose in our neighborhood." So the moral of that story is things aren't always what they appear to be. Don't be quick to jump to conclusions. And we can be really good at jumping to conclusions. It's easy to prejudge circumstances and situations. It's easy to prejudge people and even to prejudge God. There have been many times in my life where I thought I knew what was going to happen, only to find out that God had a different agenda entirely. And I've become an expert in making plans and then having them blown to smithereens. We're continuing our study in the book of Esther, and even though his name isn't mentioned, the invisible Almighty God has been working behind the scenes on behalf of his people. And don't think that he doesn't work that way today. He's still doing it. because he is weaving the seemingly insignificant details of your life into his perfect plan for you. But often he does it anonymously, and many times without your awareness or knowledge even. And Esther chapter 6 is all about reversal, about honor and dishonor, about hope and dashed hopes. It's really all about the providence of God. This chapter is filled with coincidences. Now, far too many to attribute to just mere chance. These aren't coincidences, they're God incidents. They interject hope in the midst of a seemingly impossible situation. And so when we left our story, things weren't looking so good for God's people. A young Jewish woman named Esther had been appointed queen of Persia by King Xerxes, but his prime minister, Haman, was plotting to exterminate all the Jews. Esther's older cousin Mordecai, who had raised her, was the focal point of Haman's hatred because he represented everything that he despised about the Jewish race. Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman because he had only bowed down to God. And so Haman succeeded in getting King Xerxes into signing an irreversible law that on a certain day, March 7th, it would be open season on all Jewish people. They'd be rounded up and murdered quite similar to what Hitler did during World War II. Little did Xerxes know that his own queen was Jewish. So in chapter 5, Esther risked her life to approach the king with a request to save her people. But instead of making a request to the king on behalf of her people, she demonstrated patience and trust and courage by inviting the king and Haman to a private banquet. At that banquet, when the king wants to know her request, she invites him to a second banquet the following night. And in the meantime, Haman was planning to turn Mordecai into a human shish kebab. During the night, he had a 75-foot high gallows built for everyone to see. And it looked like the end for Mordecai. He was going to die before, several months before the genocide was going to happen. But it looked hopeless. Nothing could be done. All the pieces were falling into place for their destruction. All was lost, or so it seemed. Have you ever been there? Here's the deal. God is in the details. He's working behind the scenes. And when things aren't what they seem, and he specializes in using bad things, and he can bring good out of those circumstances. And those things can be brought for his glory. And so the timing of Esther 6 is between those two banquets that Esther gives King Xerxes and Haman. So let's check out Esther 6, verses 1 through 3. That night, the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this, the king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. Well, have you discovered that sometimes momentous events hang on the smallest of details? Several years ago, a flight from New York crashed into Jamaica Bay, just a few miles from the airport. 95 people lost their lives in the crash of that plane. The FAA searched carefully through the wreckage and discovered that a tiny wire, about 6 inches long, malfunctioned and threw the rudder off. And the plane crashed, and 95 people died because one 6-inch wire malfunctioned. See, momentous events can hang on the smallest of details. And here's a king who can't sleep. And because of that, an entire people group is saved. Verse 1 starts off with the words, that night. Well, what night? The very night before Mordecai was to be executed. That night, not the night before, not the night after, but that night. That night, the king couldn't sleep. And while all of Susa slept, the king is restless. Of all nights to suffer insomnia. Poor king, I'm sure he tried everything. He probably tried melatonin. He probably tried Ambien. I heard one sleep psychiatrist say, Ambien's not addictive. I've been using it for 10 years. He tried counting sheep, chariots, the number of concubines. Nothing worked. And so I find it interesting that on the very night that Haman was getting ready to kill Mordecai, the king couldn't get to sleep. Coincidence? Not so much. It was a God incident. And that's the way it is with God. At the 11th hour, he steps in. I've heard it said that God's rescue is never late and seldom early. I heard a story about a shipwrecked man who was once washed ashore on an uninhabited island. And in the days that followed, he painstakingly built a hut with a few things he'd salvaged from the wreck and from whatever he could find on the island. That little hut was the only protection he had from the elements and the only place he could safeguard his meager possessions. It was his protection from the hot days and the cold nights. And one evening, he returned from a long search for food only to find his hut engulfed in flames. The loss devastated him. He spent the night depressed, sleeping in the sand. He awoke early the next morning and, to his surprise, saw a ship anchored off the island. A crew member stepped ashore and told him, "We saw your smoke signal and have come to rescue you." Now, see, what seemed like destruction turned out to be deliverance. And such is the case here. The Jewish nation is saved because the king had insomnia. And see, often God's miracles aren't so much in what he does, but as when he does them. See, here's the deal. God works through the timing of events. So if you have your outline, that's the first fill in the blank. God works through the timing of events. Verse 1 tells us that Xerxes couldn't get to sleep. We're not told why. He had insomnia, or maybe his mind wouldn't stop, or it was the pizza he had the night before didn't agree with him. But literally, it says the sleep of the king fled. We don't know the reasons why, but the bottom line is when God doesn't want you to sleep, you don't sleep. So he orders one of his servants to his royal library and get his book of Chronicles. Now, this is the official record of his reign up to this point. And I think he must have been really bored and wanted to get some shut-eye to have these books brought in. He could have called in one of his concubines or a court musician, maybe play a card game. But instead, he decided to have a bedtime story. I believe that he's trying to get to sleep and that this book was a mind-numbing list of ancient budget meetings, names of people who had given and received favors, a monotonous list of daily happenings. It would have been like reading the minutes from a church board meeting. So the servants, he's droning on and on. He says, "Well, Joe Dokes of 1234 Elm Street returned your call about reupholstering your golden throne. Call him at 503-1212 for a quote. John Q. Public of Main Street gives you the king his most grateful thanks for the donation of a donkey to the Children's Hospital." And I can imagine the king's eyelids getting heavier and heavier as the servant drones on. Mordecai of Susa has on this day rendered an exemplary service to the crown by thwarting an attempt on the life of the king and his kingdom. Xerxes will be forever in his debt. Jane Doe of Wall Street, and hey, wait a minute, what'd you say? No, not Jane Doe, something about Mordecai. Mordecai of Susa has on this day rendered an exemplary service to the crown by thwarting an attempt on the life of the king. Xerxes will be forever in his debt. Does it say anything about his reward? No, Your Highness. Well, we've got to do something about that. See, now, of all the books that could have been selected by the librarian from the record of Xerxes' 12 years of rule on the throne, I think it's amazing that this portion of text was chosen that contained the account of Mordecai's uncovering the assassination plot that we find in Esther 2, verses 21 and 20 through 23. This is what Esther 2 has said. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were hanged on a gallows. All this was recorded in the book of Annals in the presence of the king. This is what was read to the king on the night he couldn't sleep, the night before Mordecai is going to be executed. Coincidence, right? Well, here's another one of God's little details. God works through seemingly insignificant events. Have you found that to be true? In February 1916, a British student bought a book at a used bookstore at a railway station. He'd looked at that book and rejected it at least a dozen other times, but on that day, he decided to buy it. It was called Fantasies, and it was by George MacDonald, who was a famous English preacher. And reading this book eventually led that young man to Christ. That young man's name was C.S. Lewis, who became maybe the most articulate spokesman for the Christian faith in the 20th century. And Lewis later wrote to a friend that he had picked up this book by hazard, or by chance. Yeah, right. See, momentous events often depend on the smallest details. Has God worked in your life through events that were unexpected and seemed insignificant at the time? If you're a believer, consider the chain of circumstances that led up to your conversion to Jesus. See, chances are that God has been directing your life all along. If you're married, how did you meet and marry your spouse? Now, I went to San Jose Bible College, also known as San Jose Bridal College, and it worked in our case. And Sean was the new girl on campus. She transferred from Dallas Christian College. She's part of a traveling singing group. But my first words to her literally were, "Hey, baby, how's your love life?" True story. I know, I'm a dork. But see, the fact that we still got married is proof of God's direct intervention. But think about how God has worked in your life up to this point, using the most trivial events and twists in life to guide and direct you. It's amazing how he does it. And Mordecai has gone on living his life unnoticed and unrewarded. He could have felt unappreciated. But he doesn't have a pity party. He just continues to serve the king in relative obscurity. But when the king heard that nothing had been done for Mordecai, his wheels started turning. See, it is a huge insult in Persian society to overlook a favor. Now, we live in a stable democracy, and so we don't understand how rare it is to have a change of government by the peaceful process of an election. Our elections are getting less peaceful, but still better than, in most parts of the world and throughout much of history. The usual process of changing governments is by revolution and assassination. So in the ancient world, palace revolt was a big deal. So Xerxes is aware that this is a serious matter, and the discovery of this forgotten act moves the king greatly. He knows he owes his very life to Mordecai. On November 1st, 1950, President Harry Truman was lying in bed upstairs taking a nap at Blair House across the street from the White House, which was being renovated. And two men tried to break in and kill him at Blair House there. The Secret Service met them at the front door, and a gun battle ensued in which one of the Secret Service agents was killed. And the next day, President Truman said, it's a strange thing to realize that you're alive because another person has died. I'll never forget what he has done for me. Xerxes felt the same way about Mordecai. He wants to correct the oversight and make a public example by rewarding loyalty to the king. So now watch again, because God's timing is perfect here. Esther 6, verses 4 and 5. The king said, "Who's in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected for him. His attendants answered, "Haman is standing in the court." "Bring him in," the king ordered. Now, is this an awesome moment or what? The sun begins to come up, and Haman is so excited that today is the day he's going to finish off his long-hated enemy. So he rushes into the palace to ask permission to hang Mordecai at the exact moment the king is looking for someone to consult about Mordecai's reward. And Haman's thinking, what timing? The king's calling me. This is going to be a piece of cake. King Xerxes is thinking, what timing? My prime minister is here just in time. And God is thinking, what timing? Oh, yeah. Verse 6, when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? Haman's default setting is it's all about me. Who would the king honor other than me? Who could possibly fill the bill? Why else has he called me in? It's a no-brainer. See, and so Haman is so full of himself that he puts his original request on hold. Everything is going his way, or so he thought. He thinks, this is my moment in the sun. So let's see, what could be done for me? And I think Haman could be exhibit A of the truth of Proverbs 16, verse 18. First pride, this is the Message version. First pride, then the crash. The bigger the ego, the harder the fall. See, Haman thinks he's all that. He's been riding high with a string of successes under his belt, completely self-absorbed. Let's check out what happens next in verse 7. So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn. Write that down, royal robe king has worn. And a horse the king has ridden. Write that down, horse king has ridden, preferably white, with a royal crest placed on its head, royal crown placed on the head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the streets of the city, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. So Haman is thinking that the king's question refers to himself. So he describes his own personal dream. He has his own parade through the streets of Susa. The king is impressed with Haman's idea and says, great idea. Check out verse 10. Go at once, the king commanded. Get the robe on the horse and do just as you have suggested for, wait for it, Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. And I wish I could have been there to see Haman's face. I think it's one of the most comical and most satisfying moments in the Bible. I think the color would have drained from his face as he stood dumbfounded before the king. It would be like saying to the Oregon Ducks, the Oregon State Beavers have won the national championship in football or something like that. Kind of an in-your-face announcement. Now, Haman not only has to honor Mordecai, but he's the one that the thought of it, and he's the one that has to lead Mordecai in this procession. Verse 11. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He rode Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. You want to talk about irony and poetic justice. For an entire day, Haman was the servant of Mordecai, commanding the people to bow down and honor him. The very thing that Mordecai wouldn't do for Haman, Haman now has to tell other people to do for Mordecai. And through gritted teeth, Haman got hoarse from shouting Mordecai's praises. God really knows how to rub it in when he wants to. And that's why I think the Bible tells us not to worry about getting revenge, because God can do a pretty good job all by himself. One commentator said the words that Haman had to proclaim must have been as gravel in his mouth. See, the tide has begun to turn for God's people. Sitting on that horse in regal attire is probably the most surprised person on the planet. Mordecai had refused to bow down to Haman, and it started Haman's antagonism. And I think what is striking is what you don't hear from Haman. He's not whispering to Haman, hey, speak up, say it a little louder. Eat your heart out, Haman. Mordecai doesn't talk smack to Haman. There's no hint of vengeance on his part. And I think his silence testifies to his character. And 4 times in this section, the phrase is repeated, the man the king delights to honor. James 4:10 puts it this way, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. You can humble, here's the choice that you have when it comes to humility. You can humble yourself, make that choice, or you can have God humble you. And I can tell you from experience, it's a whole lot more painful to have God humble you. Just ask Haman. But when we make the choice to humble ourselves, God's promise is that he will exalt us in his time and in his way. Esther 6, verse 12. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. So Mordecai returns to the king's gate. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't he didn't decide it was time to ask for promotion. He just returned to the king's gate. Why? Because that's where he'd been all along. He just had a ticker tape parade through downtown Susa in his honor. And after all this pageantry and prominence, he simply returned to his place at the king's gate, where he'd been praying and fasting for the deliverance of God's people. See, I don't think success changes people who are at home with themselves. Their values and characters are too deep to be affected by outward circumstances. And I think how we handle success can be a more difficult test than how we handle failure even. See, the real question is, are you still comfortable at the king's gate? Mordecai said, hey, just drop me off here. He knew the best place on earth is at the king's gate. He is unaffected and unchanged by success. Now check out Haman's response. The last time Haman had been home, he was crowing and bragging about how great he was. Now he's eating crow as he whines about his misfortunes. And Hamans are the kind of people that always blame others for their misfortunes. They don't take responsibility for their own actions. Have you noticed that? It's never, well, God has taught me a valuable lesson, or I've been humbled through this, and in the loss I have gained, or God broke me and I've learned to trust him more. Instead, it's, if it hadn't been for him, if so-and-so hadn't done this, always playing the victim card, never realizing that they're the victim of their own independence from God. Now, evidently, Haman had neglected to mention previously that Mordecai was Jewish. Because when his advisors and his wife find out, they say to Haman, dude, your goose is cooked. You are history, bro. Check this out. Verse 13 of Esther 6. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. Haman, you are a dead man walking. Your days are numbered. And I think you've got to give them some credit for decent theology. They're right on target because God's promise to Israel is given to us in Genesis 12, verse 3. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. This is the Abrahamic covenant where God promised, I will protect my people. So if you want to stay on God's good side, I think this is a pretty important safety tip. It's a good idea to be a friend to Israel. Now, that doesn't mean I agree with everything politically the nation of Israel does or anything like that, but theologically, they're God's chosen people. And the church, we're grafted on as part of that, but, that's part of God's Abrahamic covenant. But it's been said this, and I like this quote, the wheels of God's justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. And here in the case of Haman, God's wheels grind exceedingly fine. While Haman was strutting around like a peacock, God was taking note all the time. God didn't overlook Haman and his plans to exterminate the Jews as a people and Mordecai as a person. Verse 14, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. A knock came at the door, and before Haman could even get his thoughts together, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to Esther's second banquet. He didn't have time to process what his advisors and wife had said before he swept out of his house and escorted to the palace. Haman is hurried away, and he is now the one being carried away by events beyond his control. And I can't help but think, wonder if on his way to the palace, Haman didn't glance up at that gallows and wonder if they were now meant for him instead of Mordecai. Because the enemies of God have begun to turn for the enemies of righteousness. And we've seen that things are not always as they seem, that God works in the timing events, and he works in seemingly insignificant events. So here are a couple of life lessons. From Mordecai and Haman, we learn about God's justice. Up to this point, good people are suffering and evil people are prospering. Mordecai is facing the gallows and his people are on the edge of genocide. God, why do innocent people suffer? And the flip side of the question is, why do evil people prosper? Good people suffer, innocent suffer, evil people prosper. Haman, their nemesis, is the second wealthiest and most powerful man in the Persian Empire, and he's calling his shots. And I'm sure Mordecai could have wondered, God, what is up with that? Philip Yancey, in his classic book, Disappointment with God, says this: disappointment with God happens when our expectations exceed our experience. When our expectations exceed our experience. When God doesn't run the world the way we expect him to, is the bottom line. And so let me ask you this question. If you were God, how would you run the universe? I'll tell you how I do it. Good things would happen to good people. And bad things would happen to bad people. That's the way it would be. If someone did something bad, they'd get what they deserved. Several years ago, I read about a Czechoslovakian woman named Vera Zermak of Prague. She discovered that her husband had been cheating on her, and it devastated her. So she decided to do one of two things. She was either going to kill him or kill herself, and she chose the latter. And she opened up the third-story window of her apartment, and she jumped out. But she did not die because she landed on her husband, who just happened to be in the throng of people down below. And when I read that, I thought, well, that's the way things should work. Somebody does something bad, they get struck by lightning or a flying Czechoslovakian woman or something. But when we question God's justice, we're really saying, God, you should do a better job of running the universe. You should run it like I would. And we push God off the judgment seat, and we take his place. And we presume to judge God. I have the technology to do that. I think we all do. But check out Hebrews 6, verse 10. God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown him as you have helped his people and continue to help them. See, and this is the truth. In God's economy, love trumps justice. See, love is God's default setting. In fact, that's a good thing. It's a good thing that justice isn't the first thing on God's to-do list. I'm glad that he cuts me grace and slack, but because if he didn't, there'd be no hope for me. Aren't you glad that God is not only fair, but he's gracious? And sometimes it feels like God has abandoned us. But check out Psalm 56, verse 8, New Living Translation. You keep track of all my sorrows. You've collected all my tears in your bottle. You've recorded each one in your book. And according to this verse, God has a bottle, and in that bottle is every tear you've ever cried. He keeps count of them. Do you think that he doesn't care? God has a book, and it's far more detailed than anything King Xerxes had. And in that book, he records every good work you've ever done, whether anyone else saw it or not. Now, why does he keep this record? Because someday he's going to reward you for every act, every kindness, every good thing you've done in his name. Now, and you don't gain eternal life for your good works. That's something only Jesus can give for you trusting for his death and resurrection for your sins. But once we give our lives to Christ, the Bible teaches that we will receive rewards for the good that we have done. And I've been struck by the timing in this study of Esther of what's going on in our nation right now. And I take realization in this: God is not absent. He's not absent. He's involved both in the miraculous and in the ordinary events of our lives. Even when you think God has left the building, he shows himself in unmistakable ways and lets us know that he's still involved, he's still in charge, and he still cares. In the Old Testament book of Habakkuk, it says this, listen carefully. The law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. Believers in the Old Testament had difficult times. They doubted God's justice, even the prophets. Now, I like the story of the farmer in the Midwest who had a strong dislike for religion. And as he plowed his field on Sunday mornings, he would mock the people who drove by him on their way to worship services. October came, and the farmer had his finest crop ever, the best in the entire county, in fact. When the harvest was complete, he placed an ad in the local paper which belittled the Christians for their faith in God. And near the end of this diatribe, he wrote, "Faith in God must not mean much if someone like me can prosper." And the response from the Christian community locally was awesome. In the next edition of the town paper, a small ad appeared, and it read simply this: God does not settle all of his accounts in October. See, and here's what we find out. God's justice will prevail. It will prevail. In this chapter, we've seen God's poetic justice, but his justice is more than poetic. It is transcendent, and it is ultimate. God's perfect justice is a function of timing. Now think about it. When Mordecai reported the assassination attempt on the king, if he'd been rewarded immediately when he was supposed to be, his life would not have been spared later. He was rewarded at the perfect time. If Mordecai was ever puzzled because the king ignored him and promoted Haman instead, he found out that God's not done yet. And when you don't understand why God allows sorrow and injustice in your life, realize this: God's not done. He doesn't settle all of his accounts in October. And there'll come a day when he makes all things right and when all accounts will be settled. But in the meantime, we live in a broken down, fallen, toxic world that groans for redemption. And if you expect perfect justice in this world, you're going to be sadly disappointed, because this place is not heaven. Important note to self. And perhaps you've heard the story about the missionary couple who had given their lives in service to the kingdom overseas, cross-culturally. And they lived in humble and difficult circumstances all their lives, away from family and friends. And at the end of their ministry, when they didn't have the health to continue serving, they flew back to the U.S. And on the plane was a football team. And when they got to their home city, they stepped off the plane to much fanfare and celebration. The airport was packed and cheering for this football team, but there wasn't a single person to greet them at the airport. And the missionary guy said, I tried to fight his disappointment and bitterness, but he said, so after years of serving, this is the reception when we come home. And his wife simply said, but we're not home yet. You know, our real home is with Jesus. At the end of the day, it's not really a question of which side God is on. The real question is, which side are you on? That's the most, it's not about politics or economics or even football games. It's about having a personal relationship with God. And you can do that today as we close out. So will you join me as we pray? God, I thank you for your word. And Jesus, we just say, I thank you for dying on a cross and forgive me of my sins and rising from the dead to assure that we can have relationship with you forever. We can have that hope and that faith. And so, God, we place our hope and our trust in you. And we say, may your will be done in our lives as it is in heaven. In Jesus' name, amen. If you prayed along with me for the first time, would you let me know about that? You can tell me personally, and I'd like to talk to you and pray with you about that. Or you can tell me through a connection card or however. But we really would like to know if you've made that decision.